If the Topkapi harem under Suleiman the Magnificent was a complex mechanism of power where every cog had to turn in silence, then Sumbul Agha was its chief watchmaker. Not the sultan, not the vizier, not even the sultana, but a eunuch. And what a eunuch he was! His presence in the corridors of power was like that invisible stitch in an expensive carpet. You don't see it, but it holds the entire pattern together. We know him from the dazzling costumes of the series Magnificent Century, a somewhat portly, devoted, sometimes comical servant of Hurrem. The historical reality was both more complex and harsher. This was not merely an Agha, one among many. This was the Kizlar Aghasi, the Chief Black Eunuch, the superintendent of the harem, the overseer of thousands of lives, intrigues, and secrets, a position whose influence could rival that of the Grand Vizier. He was feared, his opinion was valued, and petitions were made through him. His loyalty to the Sultan was absolute, like a honed blade. Yet this same loyalty placed him on a dangerous edge in the era's most resounding duel, the Cold War between Mahidevran Sultan, mother of the heir Mustafa, and the rising power of Hurrem. Here, within those walls, where a whisper could cost a head, Sumbul Agha had to balance his fidelity to the sovereign, his respect for tradition, and the growing influence of the new favorite, whom that very sultan adored. How did this master of Palace Zen die? In this video, we will try to separate the series' fiction from the dry chronicles, piece together his true biography, assess his significant contribution to governing the palace state, and finally understand what circumstances, political, palatial, human, could have led to the twilight of such an extraordinary life. This is not a story about the throne, but about the shadow it casts, and sometimes within that shadow lay more power than in the very radiance of authority. And shadows, as we know, can be remarkably tenacious.
History. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell because next time we will peek into places where even sunlight entered the Topkapi palace with trepidation. He did not begin as a slave, and this is the first key to understanding Sümbül. Most children caught in the gears of the devshirme came from simple families. His story was different. Take the myth of the Byzantine prince propagated by Venetian diplomats, add to it the Ottoman chronicles hinting at good birth, and you arrive at the formula most painful to him, an aristocrat who became a thing. Somewhere in Greek Thrace or Macedonia in the 1490s, there lived a boy. Perhaps his name was Georgios or Konstantinos or something else. His world was the world of Byzantium's ruins, a half-forgotten ancestral crest on the wall, kitchen table conversations about past greatness, a pride not broken even by the Ottoman era. His family was likely among those the Turks called herder nobles, local aristocracy left with shreds of power in exchange for loyalty and taxes. And then one day, the jizya collectors, the gatherers of the blood tax, entered this fragile world. They were not looking for just any healthy boys. They were looking for the best, the most clever, the most promising, and the future Sümbül was selected. His father, a minor archon, could do nothing. All his nobility, all the past grandeur of his lineage shattered against the iron logic of the empire. The captive prince was taken to Constantinople, which had already become Istanbul. And then the factory for remaking people. The procedure politely called castration, in reality a meat grinder with monstrous mortality. Black masters from Sudan. Boys died from pain shock, loss of blood, infection, 8 out of 10. But the protagonist of our video survived. The physically robust constitution of the Greek aristocrat, honed by centuries of selection, played its part. He paid the highest price for entry into his new life, becoming a white eunuch. His past was cut away as definitively as his flesh. Now he was a blank slate, upon which the empire would inscribe a new text. The school in Galata is a ripening chamber. Here, wounds heal and memory is erased. The Turkish language, the basics of Islam, obedience. The psyche is broken and reassembled. Most were broken forever, but some, the smartest and strongest-willed, found a strange freedom in this breaking. No family, no lineage, no future in the usual sense. Therefore, one could belong entirely to the system, become its perfect cog. The boy, now called Sümbül, Hyacinth, an elegant nickname masking the horror, chose precisely this path.
The Enderun was the inner kitchen of the empire. It was not merely a school, it was a social elevator moving at a glacial pace. Here, one passed through all the stages, from a chamber cleaner to a library apprentice. 10 years of rigorous training. The Persian poetry of Hafez, the Arabic script of the Quran, the intricacies of administrative law, the art of drafting reports, and above all, the art of silence and observation. His teachers were the finest minds of the state. His classmates, the future viziers and pashas. It was here that Sumbul Agha came into being, educated, devout, absolutely loyal, and lethally dangerous in his knowledge. By the time Suleiman ascended to the throne, he was already the finished product of the Ottoman system, a man without a past whose only homeland was now called Topkapi. Sumbul Agha's path to the summit was not a triumphal procession. It was a game of chess where pieces were put at stake daily and a trap lurked around every corner. He started from a position that, for most, became a lifelong dead end, an ichoglani, a junior servant in the third courtyard of Topkapi. His world, then, consisted of mountains of copperware that had to be polished to a shine by morning, and piles of laundry belonging to people whose faces he never even saw. It was a school not of service, but of survival. Hundreds of eunuchs around him dreamed of one thing, to escape this hell of physical labor. Some tried to ingratiate themselves with flattery, others with denunciations. Sümbül chose a different tactic. He became a master of quiet observation. He didn't just remember who owed whom, he deduced who feared whom, and on whom the informal networks of influence rested. This was his first capital, informational. Suleiman's ascension to the throne in 1520 became a sign of hope for many. With a new master, one could expect a reshuffling of positions. Sümbül deftly used the moment, moving into the very thick of events, to the harem, gaining a shred of formal power as the hazinadar, the keeper of jewels. Here, intrigue no longer smelled of sweat and soap, but of rosewater and fear. Here, a mistake cost not a flogging, but a disappearance in the waters of the Bosporus. He found himself caught between two fires, the ambitious Mahidevran, mother of the heir, and the young sultan, whose attention was the new currency. Sümbül made the only correct choice for his position. He pledged his allegiance not to a woman or a clan, but to the throne. His loyalty to Suleiman was demonstrative, almost loud, and it was noticed.
But the real ticket upward was handed to him by a man with a similar fate. Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, also a Greek risen from obscurity, detected in the silent, efficient eunuch a kindred intellect. He saw not just a servant, but a perfect instrument. The harem was a black box, an uncharted territory even for the vizier. Sümbül became his guide, his eyes and ears in the chambers where the fates of the empire were decided. In return, Ibrahim propelled him into a key position, the Kizlar Agha, chief of the Black Eunuchs. Now, Sümbül controlled the door. Everyone who entered or exited the harem passed through his filter. He was the dispatcher of rumors, favorites, and poisons. It was in this post that he encountered a new force, Hurrem, the Slavic concubine whose tenacity knew no bounds.
Through him, Ibrahim conveyed messages and support to her, and through him received feedback in return. Sümbül became the bridge between the two most powerful upstarts of the Ottoman Empire, the Greek Vizier and the future Slavic Sultana. At that moment, he was no longer merely surviving, he was weaving himself into the very framework of power. And then came Ibrahim's execution in 1536. For all the Pasha's protégés, this was a death sentence. The palace corridors were being swept clean of the disgraced vizier's supporters. Sümbül stood on the edge of the abyss. He was saved by what he had always saved for a rainy day. He presented Suleiman not with tearful excuses, but with dry reports proving that his service had always been exclusively to the Sultan, not to his favorite. He survived the purge. He endured. And he emerged from that storm tempered and truly dangerous. He had learned the main lesson. Alliances are temporary. Only institutional power is eternal. By the early 1540s, he had reached the apogee and an unprecedented level of control. His working day was the micromanagement of an empire. In the morning, reviewing reports from harem spies. After lunch, taking inventory of the Janissary arsenal. By evening, receiving the Venetian ambassador with secret proposals, and at night, auditing the ledgers of the treasury where mountains of golden ducats lay. He transformed the chaotic organism of the palace into a well-oiled machine. He introduced an accounting system that eliminated theft. He created his own intelligence network parallel to that of the Grand Vizier. European diplomats, exasperated by his incorruptibility, wrote in their reports that the Sultan has a shadow, and that shadow is Sümbül. He had become an administrative genius, a beneficiary of Ottoman meritocracy, where one's origins could be buried under the weight of competence.
His day did not begin at sunrise, but an hour before it, in the pre-dawn silence of the fourth courtyard, where the air still carried the scent of night dampness and rose-water. The first step was toward the Babu Sadet, the Gate of Felicity, not a poetic exaggeration, but a technical term. This gate was the only legal passage between the Salamlik, the male world, and the harem, the female universe. Anyone who crossed this threshold, from a vizier with a report to a supplier of sweets, was searched by his black eunuchs. Here, Sümbül was not an administrator, but a first-class security engineer. One missed dagger or a vial of something murky, and the entire structure of power could collapse like a house of cards. His power was the power of schedule and ritual. He moved through the palace like a shadow, synchronizing the Sultan's biological clock with the cosmic rhythm of the empire. Suleiman's morning prayer in the Has Oda, breakfast in solitude, then the session of the Diwan, where he stood behind the lattice, invisibly recording every sigh and gesture of the Pashas. He knew who held a gaze too long, who shifted from foot to foot, whose voice wavered. In the evening, bowing at the feet of the sovereign, he would whisper reports not about laws or taxes, but about moods. He was the algorithm filtering the informational noise for Suleiman himself. But the true magic happened in the harem. 300 to 400 women, each a potential volcano of ambition, resentment, or love. Managing this world was like conducting an orchestra where every musician dreamed of becoming a soloist, all while wielding an instrument with a poisoned hidden compartment. Sümbül distributed chambers, silks, rations, and more importantly, access to information. Hurrem in her upper pavilion received news first, Mahidevran got it second hand, and the new Ajemi girls received only scraps of rumors. His black eunuchs were not just guards, but living motion sensors, reading every whisper in the corridors. He didn't just prevent scandals, he engineered the very fabric of the harem's daily life, where any deviation from the routine was a red flag. When Suleiman departed on campaign, and in the 1540s this happened often, the palace mechanism did not stop. It merely switched to autonomous mode, and Sümbül was the pilot. He coordinated the flows, grain and wool for the army from Anatolia, gold for the treasury from Egypt, news of unrest from the Balkans. He decided what to report to the Sultan immediately by courier and what to postpone until his return. The European ambassadors languishing in the reception halls understood this perfectly. They wrote to Venice and Vienna not of the chief eunuch, but of the shadow sultan, whose no was a final verdict.
His influence seeped beyond the marble walls of Topkapi, shaping the taste and fashion of an entire era. Orders for tiles for a new mosque, the selection of Persian miniatures for the library, the cut of kaftans for courtiers, all passed through his approval. During the Eid al-Fitr celebration, it was his invisible hand that arranged the 1,000-strong processions so that every spectator, from a janissary to a beggar, felt the inexorable power of the dynasty. This was a theater where the director never took a bow. Yet within this perfect system lay a flaw. His power was absolute only for as long as he remained the perfect servant, invisible. Any hint of personal interest, any suspicion of playing his own game, shattered the delicate balance. And as passions in the harem intensified and the stakes in the struggle for the succession grew, Sümbül's neutrality became his most dangerous and precarious position. The watchmaker knew, within the mechanism he had so carefully assembled, a bomb had already begun to tick. The relationship between Sumbul Agha and Hurrem Sultan is not a story of friendship. It is a story of a deal, a bilateral, highly profitable, but extremely risky contract, where the stakes were not money, but the only thing that held value in the Topkapi palace, access to the body and mind of the Sultan. It all began in the 1520s, in the stifling atmosphere of the harem, where the air was thick not with the scent of roses, but with fear and ambition. On one side was Sümbül, the Chief Black Eunuch, Kizlar Agha. His career was made, his authority over the inner quarters nominal, but in the politics of the Sultan's court he was a pawn. He needed leverage, a figure capable of influencing Suleiman, not through administrative reports, but through the pillow. On the other side was Alexandra Lisovska, a captured Ruthenian girl given the name Hurrem. Intelligent, daring, utterly alone, and lethally dangerous. Her enemy number one was Mahidevran Sultan, the mother of the heir. Her only resource was the Padishah's attention, which could at any moment shift to another. Their alliance was born from this calculation. Sümbül became Hurrem's shadow assistant. He was her link to the outside world and to the Sultan during his absences. Historical records dryly note it was he who organized the secret correspondence that allowed Hurrem to maintain an emotional bond with Suleiman during his military campaigns. In return, Hurrem, gaining power, became his shield. When Mahidevran accused the eunuch of spying for the infidels, a death sentence under other circumstances, it was the influence of the Hasaki that saved his career and possibly his life. They were a perfect tandem. She managed Suleiman's heart, he managed the flows of information and people within the harem. Venetian ambassadors observing this duo reported to the Serene Republic they were like the pilot and navigator of a single ship, sailing confidently toward its goal, sweeping rivals aside. The fall of Mahidevran and her exile, this was their joint victory. But every perfect deal develops a crack when the balance of power shifts. The point of rupture was none other than Hurrem's son-in-law, Rustem Pasha. Sümbül, raised in the strict hierarchy of the palace, saw Rustem as a dangerous upstart. a man who, through marriage to Hurrem Sultan, had not merely entered the family, but had begun building his own empire of influence, subjugating the old cliques. For the pragmatic eunuch, Rustem was a threat to stability. His greed and profligacy could irritate the Sultan and provoke a wrath that would fall upon everyone, including Sümbül himself. And here occurred the first serious breakdown in their alliance program. Sümbül, true to his primary mission, serving the dynasty and Suleiman personally, began reporting on Rustem to the Padishah. He acted not as a traitor to Hurrem, but as an insurance agent trying to prevent the collapse of the entire system. But for the Hasaki, this was pure betrayal. Her family, her blood, her daughter and son-in-law were now her primary project, more important than the old friendship with a court official. A harsh counterattack followed. Hurrem managed to convince Suleiman that Sümbül was slandering out of personal envy. The result was temporary disgrace, demotion, and the purge of his people. Their paths diverged irrevocably over the figure of Hurrem. For Sümbül, she remained the master's daughter, a precious jewel to be shielded from dirty politics. For Hurrem, she was a strategic asset in the grand game for the empire's future after Suleiman. When the eunuch tried to challenge the marital and political combinations involving the princess, he stood in the way not merely of a woman weary of intrigue, but of a sovereign politician building a dynastic dictatorship.
The series The Magnificent Century took this dry skeleton of historical facts and clothed it in flesh, blood, and nerves. Here, Sümbül is not just a functionary, but a character with a biography, trauma, and a sarcastic, almost cynical humor that became his chainmail. His relationship with Hurrem is portrayed as an epic saga of platonic love, devotion, and bitter betrayal. The series gifts them moments absent from the chronicles, secret nighttime conversations over a cup of sherbet where they scheme like the closest of friends. His fatherly jealousy towards her children, her tears, which she shows only to him. The series transforms their rupture from an administrative conflict into a personal tragedy, understandable to everyone. So, what do we have in the end? Reality, a cold, calculating tandem that fell apart when the interests of the parties ceased to align. Pragmatism triumphed over personal connection. Drama, a story of almost chivalric devotion and its collapse, where the personal dimension outweighed the political. But both narratives converge on the main point. This alliance was the quintessence of Ottoman power. Hurrem, a woman, used the institution of the eunuchs, those sinews of the system, to subjugate the patriarchy itself. And Sümbül, the guardian of ancient rules, ultimately became a victim of the new reality he helped bring into the world. If Sümbül's bond with Ibrahim was about blood, then with Rustem Pasha it was solely about money and power. Their relationship is a perfect detective story about how pragmatic cooperation turns into mortal hatred. At first, Sümbül was useful. It was he, as the chief steward of the palace, who brilliantly organized the wedding of Rustem and Hurrem, Suleiman's daughter. This was his contribution to the rise of a new player. But it very soon became clear that Rustem was playing a different game, not an imperial one, but a personal one. The chronicles unanimously hiss about his unprecedented greed, millions of akçes flowing into the pasha's pockets. For Sümbül, who grew up in the strict discipline of the palace, this was not merely corruption, it was an insult to the entire order, the backbone of which he considered himself to be.
And here, Sümbül makes a risky move. He stops whispering and begins to speak directly into Suleiman's ear. The reports of Rustem's bribes hit their mark. The Pasha is temporarily stripped of his seal. But Rustem is not Ibrahim. He has armor stronger than favor, the love of Hurrem, and the status of the Sultan's son-in-law. His response was precise and ruthless. Not a direct attack on Sümbül, but a methodical purge of his retinue. Dozens of loyal eunuchs, his eyes and hands, disappeared into the basements of Topkapi. It was a cold war within the walls of the Seraglio. Their verbal duels, if the playwrights are to be believed, were masterpieces of hidden threat, polite addresses that carried the unspoken message, "I will destroy you." The culmination of this confrontation was the tragedy of Prince Mustafa. Sümbül, connected by many threads to the camp of the disgraced prince, and Rustem, the chief accuser, found themselves on opposite sides of the barricade. After Mustafa's execution, only silence remained between them, thick as tar. As for the relationship with Nurbanu, this was no longer just a conflict, it was an omen. The cunning Venetian captive, who became the wife of Prince Selim, looked at Sümbül not as an ally, but as a monument to the passing era of Suleiman and Hurrem. She was the future, and he was the living past that hindered the building of that future. After Hurrem's death, Sümbül, deprived of powerful cover, became vulnerable. Ambitious Nurbanu saw in him an obstacle on the path to complete control over the harem and, most importantly, over her husband Selim. The chronicles directly accuse her people of poisoning the old Agha. It doesn't matter if this is true or black PR. What matters is the fact itself. In the struggle for power, a new regime always seeks to erase the architects of the old one. Sümbül, who survived Ibrahim, outmaneuvered Rustem, and raised Mirhima, found himself powerless against the cold calculation of one who played the long game for an entire reign ahead. His network of alliances, so strong under Suleiman, tore on a simple truth. Palace walls remember everyone, but protect no one forever.
Sümbül's character is a layered pie of Ottoman psychology. Loyalty, noted by Ottoman chroniclers, was combined with Greek cunning. His manipulations were finer than a calligraphic flourish, a planted letter, an accidentally overheard conversation, a hint sown in the fertile soil of the Sultan's distrust. Another historian of the era called him nothing less than a fox in silks. But Sümbül's main weapon was humor, the kind born on the edge of tragedy. European ambassadors would note down his jokes with astonishment. "I am like this crystal goblet," he seemed to be telling the Venetian envoy, "transparent on the outside, empty within. But emptiness has its advantages. Poison does not linger." He was the first to laugh at his own position, transforming a physical flaw into an intellectual advantage. In the series, this trait is brilliantly captured in lines that viewers quote endlessly. His piety was of a peculiar kind. Daily prayers coexisted with a deep skepticism towards religious fanatics. He performed the Hajj through proxies, a rare practice for the time, an almost metaphorical pilgrimage. Over the years, the melancholy that had always slumbered somewhere in the depths of his consciousness began to rise to the surface. The death of Hurrem in 1558, according to some indirect accounts, shattered him more than one might have expected. They were strange allies, a Slavic slave who rose to become sultana, and a Greek who had become the shadow of the throne. Both were outsiders who had built their own empires within the empire. The very man whose name was synonymous with the Topkapi harem, whose silence could ruin careers, and whose nod could decide the fate of a province, was now learning to walk again, not metaphorically, literally. Every step on the gleaming floor of the Seraglio echoed through his bones with a dull, aching pain. The mid-1550s, Suleiman still reigns, the empire still radiates heat, but inside Sumbul Agha, something is irreversibly breaking. The body, for decades the perfect instrument of service, impenetrable, enduring, has begun its betrayal.
This was not a sudden blow. It was a slow ebb. Modern medicine would call it systemic collapse. The consequences of the castration performed decades ago had finally caught up with him. The hormonal storm had subsided, leaving a desert in its wake. Bones were losing calcium, becoming brittle like old parchment. Metabolism slowed to a crawl, cloaking the body in soft, useless tissue. He, the slender shadow man, began to transform into the typical a portly eunuch whose ancient sorrow was inscribed in his very shape. Ottoman statistics, had they been kept, would have been merciless. The chances of someone like him living to 80 did not exceed 10%. The chronicles record the first cracks dryly, lameness after a fall in the gardens. But imagine not just a fall. Imagine the supreme castellan, the god of order, stumbling over his own feet before the eyes of frozen gardeners. The world he had built with a ruler began to sway. To the lameness was added a fever, perhaps malaria, an echo of past trips to Egypt for goods for Hurrem. And then a cough, bloody and insistent, like an uninvited guest. A Venetian spy, marking the end of an era, reported, "Sümbül, once vigorous, now coughs blood and complains of Greek pains." These Greek pains, that was all the doctors could say. They treated him with saffron, opium for sleep, and mercury, a poison passed off as a panacea. The disease would retreat like a disloyal vassal, only to return with renewed force. That day began as usual, with pain. Pain in swollen legs bound by gout, and the familiar metallic taste in the mouth after a night of coughing. Sümbül, once the fearsome guardian of the Sultan's chambers, and now an infirm eunuch, spent the morning in the half-light of his quarters. He prayed, conversed with faithful protégés, young eunuchs who still remembered his strength. It was a ritual of transmission, an attempt to bequeath not power, but knowledge. And then lunch. Pilaf with fatty lamb and sweet cold sherbet, the final act of everyday life, which became the first act of tragedy. Suddenly, the world shrank to a sharp, searing fire in his gut. Then convulsions, twisting his body into a knot. What was that? A flare-up of an old illness, or something new, swift and merciless? The official, calm medical version simply states God's will. Age, ailments, gout, edema, an exhausting cough. The castration in childhood, that was not just a physical trauma. It was a ticking time bomb for the body. Fragile bones, a disrupted metabolism, weakened blood vessels. A body that had served its purpose simply stopped. This version is dull, rational, and probably close to the truth. But where is there room for palace secrets in it? The poisonous, scandalous, political version. Now here is where the real thriller begins. The prime suspect is Hurrem Sultan, the future Valide, a woman building her faction of power with iron resolve. And Sumbul Agha? He was a living archive. He remembered all the secrets of Hurrem Sultan, was loyal to her daughter, Mirhima. He was the last major figure of the old guard, a living link to the era of Suleiman. He knew too much, and he was weak, a perfect target. Poison in the sherbet, a classic of the genre. Arsenic, causing precisely those symptoms, a cutting pain in the stomach, convulsions, vomiting. The perpetrator? Perhaps one of the Ethiopian eunuchs who had already defected to Nurbanu's camp. The motive is impeccable. A threat eliminated, power consolidated. This version is the embodiment of paranoia and the logic of an absolutist court, where the death of one man is not a drama, but an administrative measure. The story of Sumbul Agha is drawing to a close, and his death is not merely a full stop in a biography. It is the perfect metaphor for the end of an entire world, a world the series showed us with such sumptuous, painful detail. We know how he left, peacefully, in his sleep, of old age, in his chambers, surrounded by a silence that, for a man who lived his life at the heart of the loudest palace in the universe, was probably the rarest and most precious reward. This is not the death of a warrior or a martyr. This is the death of an archivist, a keeper of secrets, who takes the lion's share of them with him, because there is no one left to tell. And herein lies the creator's brilliant irony.
They took a real historical figure, plucked him from his native 17th century, and elegantly, without unnecessary explanation, inserted him into a different timeline. And he took root, not as a foreign element, but as the missing puzzle piece. Because the palace of Sultan Suleiman lacked this Sumbul Agha, cold, cynical, utterly devoted not to an idea, but to the system. He was the living embodiment of the empire's bureaucratic apparatus, its faceless yet absolutely necessary nervous system. He did not burn with passion like Ibrahim. He did not wrestle with ideological quests. He simply ensured the process, and in that lay his titanic strength. That is why his death is the true end of the magnificent century. Not when the Sultan dies, not even when Hurrem fades. The era of Suleiman the Magnificent ends the moment the heart of its primary witness and ruthless recorder quietly stops. With him departs not just a servant, the palace's operational memory departs. The understanding of how things truly were departs. All that remains are official chronicles, passionate legends, and silence. His death is a sign. The bridge is burned. The road back no longer exists.